My
This
background has
conference will
been,
now be recorded.
functioning in the Fortune 500 healthcare world. I've seen a lot of policy making. I've seen a lot of folks breaking policies. Seen a lot of promulgating policies that get disregarded, and I've seen a lot of good policies. And so I've had a lot of experience just being able to operate in environments where policy is important, especially from a data security standpoint, dealing with protected health information from patients and things like that in the healthcare space is important. So all those things have to be very carefully governed by policy. So I just wanted to go through a few different concepts, really starting off with why should you, as a small business owner or somebody who's wanting to be able to provide services to other small businesses, why would you want to have anything to do with policies in the first place? What types of policies might be interesting to you and might help you in your business or help you with your clients? And then go just about talking for a few minutes about how policies can be developed and enforced, because really when it comes down to it, a policy that's just written up, slapped on a drive somewhere and left to sit is not going to do anybody any good. And so really enforcing policies is a really important part of the overall policy engagement process. So the first part of it again is going back to, so why generate policies in the first place? Really a policy is something that is, for one, it allows you to set the expectations that employees that you hire or your clients or customers have of you as an employer or a service provider. So we can have policies obviously that are internal facing into your company, that are working towards helping your employees and folks and contractors and folks that you work with inside your organization know how to operate and how to operate effectively, and do the things that you want them to do. Um, but it also helps them understand what they should expect of you as well as an employer, and what things that they can go back to you and say, hey, you're not holding up your end of the bargain based on this policy that you've generated that says X, Y, and Z. So it does help set expectations for your employees, and it helps set expectations that you have as an employer for those employees, all when we're talking about the internal facing side of your policy. But then there's also the other side of it. How do you set policies, or what policies should you set to help make sure that, um, sounds like somebody's getting in out of their car. Mute that one.
Sorry, that was me. Can you mute me? I don't want to be.
Let's see.
Thank you.
Austin, can
Now
you
I
grab
can't
that?
hear you. Great. Thank you.
So then we're dealing with external policies that are facing out to your clients and customers. That also, again, helps to make sure that everybody knows the rules of the game for how you, as a services provider or a provider somebody who's selling products out into a marketplace, everybody knows what the rules of engagement are for how to work with you. So those things are super important for just setting expectations. But then also, when we're talking about internal policies and sometimes external policies, one of the reasons for having those also is to make sure that you reduce your liability overall. When you have an employee who knows and has signed off on a particular policy and is aware of it, and they do something that's outside of policy that might cause that cause them to injure themselves or somebody else, being able to fall back on a policy and say this employee was not abiding by the policy will help to make sure that if you have to engage in disciplinary actions, that those things don't come back on you. And also just to help indicate that, hey, we did have a scenario set up so this employee could work and operate safely. They chose not to do that. And it helps just reduce the overall liability scenario for the employer in that situation. And one of the other scenarios that I think we need to talk about too is overall policy development and having those things in place to drive your business. And we'll discuss that a little bit more here in just a few minutes. But when people are looking at buying your business, for instance, they're going to want to see that you have a full set of policies that allow them to continue to operate your business if you make an exit during that buyout. And so we'll discuss it, like I said, here in just a few minutes. But before that, let's go into different types of policies and some of the examples of things that you might want to draft a policy around if you're a small business. One of the first things, and I'm sure Austin will also back this up, that you'll want to do is have a workplace safety policy. You want to have disciplinary policies in place. One thing that I think is really important for most employers nowadays too, especially when we have, in the age of smartphones and data, just being able to be moved from one place to another, is have a device use policy. What do you want people looking at on their devices while they're working for you during work hours, or what is the way that you want them to interact with devices and computers within your work environment. Another one that I think sometimes gets overlooked is just work hours and turnaround time policies. So when you're talking about making sure that people understand how you're going to deal with overtime, what constitutes overtime. Obviously state law will say some things about that. But is there any additional information on top of that you want to add that's pertinent to the way that you engage in your business with your employees? And then turnaround time policies. Is there a certain set way that you want products or services turned around for your customers or clients, or even for you if you're working on internal projects? And how are those things defined in your policies? Is there a way for you to set up a scenario where everybody can look at the policy and say, I know that when I'm engaged in a project X, that I am supposed to be able to provide all the results of that project in this fashion within this time frame, and that's all set out in policies, so that it's already understood ahead of time for most of the projects that you work on, so you're not having to constantly retool and reset expectations in regard to those things constantly within your business. When we're talking about policies that are kind of outward facing, some of the obvious examples of those are going to be things dealing with like late payment policies, return and refund policies, and also complaint policies. How do you funnel complaints back in so you can deal with them from customers or clients as they come back in? Now, some of those things we can deal with not just in internal written policies, but also in the way that we interact with our customers and clients through contracts. And that's we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second as well. But one of the things I wanted to focus on, outside of just policy types, is really going back to how policies drive your business continuity and services consistency sides of things. I've had the opportunity to work with a few different folks who are Six Sigma certified, and they go around and they help businesses set up policies and process documents that allow those businesses to be consistent in the services and the goods that they provide. And I think there's a lot of merit in that, and there's definitely a huge amount of need for that, especially in the small business world. I think one of the things that's made McDonald's and other turnkey organizations that that work with lots of different deployment models, I guess. But when it comes down to it, when you're dealing with organizations that are able to provide a consistent product or service, the thing that you're always going to find behind those things are policies. And so if you want folks to be able to have a consistent experience with your business, it's one thing to just talk to your employees and say, hey, this is how it's done, right? This is how we do it. But I actually talked to a guy who ran an experiment one time. He said, he went into a healthcare environment in a hospital, and he sat down and he wanted to see how this hospital helped staff engage in intake processes for when a patient comes in, and just wanted to see how that worked and how they trained people on how to do that. And so they showed him a training session where they had 2 new recruits who had come in to help at the intake desk, and they sat down with somebody who knew what they were doing at the computer, and that person took them through the process of how to engage in intake of a patient. And what they found in that scenario was that as he interviewed those 2 new people later, he found that one person focused on one set of things, the other person focused on an entirely different set of things, and their learning experience was totally different. And so he said, in that environment, obviously, if you're just training people based on, explaining things to an employee and expecting them to understand what the expectation is, it's not going to work. It's always going to fail. There's always going to be points that are going to have to be reiterated and reiterated and reiterated over and over again. Whereas if you have a written policy and you have a manual that you can hand an employee that has the written policies in there, they can read through that, and there may be some misinterpretation of what's written, but the fact that they can refer back to the policy manual over and over and over again in regard to different situations means that you're going to have the more likely have those employees engage in that policy scenario the way that you want them to, and that the experience for your customers and clients is going to be extremely more consistent than if we're just engaging in word of mouth policy indoctrination for employees and folks that you hire on. So from the internal perspective, that's super important. Just making sure that, from the business consistency side, that the policies are drafted and written down. But then once you've drafted a policy and written it down, how do you go about enforcing that policy? How do you go about making sure that people, for one, have agreed to it and are willing to engage in that policy in the way that you want them to? And that's always the tricky part. I've seen some really big companies do some interesting things in regard to employee and contractor policy sign off, and really the part about that I've seen that's been fascinating is I've seen it where they've developed modules where you go in and you watch somebody explain the policy to you in some sort of a learning platform, and then you're required to then sign the screen, have your signature somewhere on the screen indicating that you've gone through that policy training scenario, that you've been provided copies of the policy, and that you're willing to adhere to the policy. So if you're a business that's been in place for a while and you have employees that you want to make sure that they understand updates to the policy, that's one way of doing it. But really what I've seen as being the most effective way for policies to be implemented within an organization is to merely draft processes around those policies and incorporate your policies into the processes and procedures that your employees engage in every day, so that it's just wrapped up in part of the business process. So I guess one way to look at that is that does require you then to not only have policies in place that say, this is how we do things, this is what's expected of you, this is what you can expect of me, but then take those pieces of the policy that are important to you and build them into a written process document that says, not only is this what's expected, but this is how we get it done, and this is how we meet those expectations. And so engaging in the drafting of process documents is something that some folks have a real hard time with, and I'm still trying to figure this out in some ways, right? Because I've had instances where I've worked within an organization at a really large healthcare company. I was working in the IT department, and we had this organization called the vendor management organization. And the vendor management team was run by a guy who had been doing vendor management for a long time. He'd run many big teams at a bunch of different big corporations. And it was his job to come in and make sure that contracts were negotiated according to company policy with different IT vendors. And so he had a big team of folks who were running a business process outsourcing scenario for him, so that he could increase his staff and decrease his staff as needed to accommodate the volume of contracts that were coming through, and running those contracts through a particular process in order to get the contracts in, receive them in, and then have contracts that are completed, signed, and negotiated. Well, I guess it would be completed, negotiated, and signed out the other side for the business to be able to move forward with. And so in between those two things, the intake of contracts and then the providing the finished product, which is a negotiated and signed contract, there was this whole space where there needed to be a process set up in order to incorporate different aspects of the company's policy into that negotiation process. And where it came down to those different policies that were involved, you had obviously policies related to HIPAA, you had policies related to other data security concerns, you had policies related to who approved that contract coming into the process. because you also had to make sure that that person who approved the project had a budget to be able to accomplish the, or to pay for the services or the software once the contract was completed. And so there was a bunch of different policies that intersected the process. And as I watched him over time work with his team to accomplish what they were supposed to, what I realized pretty quickly is this guy cannot follow a process to save his life.
Corey, we've lost sound.
Telling me that your computer's disconnected you from audio for some reason. So for those on the phone, we're just taking a minute trying to get audio connected again.
Can you hear me now, Austin?
Yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can. I'm having some microphone issue here, and I don't understand what the issue is. So I'm having all kinds of technical difficulties today. Sorry about that. Interesting. So anyway, going back to that scenario I was talking about. So this guy that I was working with could not follow the process, or he could not develop a process that enabled him to be able to accomplish what was needed to be able to make sure that the policies that the business had set down were being able to be enforced. And so as I realized that developing the process was going to be the key for him to be able to enforce policy, I sat down and I went through with him and his team, okay, what is it that your process is supposed to be? And I had to document it. Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to have multiple connections now through the system for the audio, but somehow it restored my other connection. So developing the process was an interesting scenario where I sat down with them and I ran through what it is that they wanted to accomplish and how. And it was as simple, to me, it was as simple as saying, okay, so you know what your policies need to be. Let's now just say, okay, we need to add this policy into this portion of the process. And we said, okay, so when you want to make sure that the data security aspects of this contract are negotiated in, then how do you want to accomplish that? And they said, well, we need to send that over to the information security team and make sure that they review, this particular software vendor's system and to make sure that it's secure. I said, okay, fine. So you write that into the process and you say, all right, so at this point we received a document. We have made sure that the stakeholder who wants to have this contract negotiated agrees that yes, we still want to move forward with this. We've checked their budget. And now we're saying the first thing that we need to do with this, if there's data security implications to it, is send this over to the information security team and have them review it, right? Yes. Okay. And so we walked through this process, and they still couldn't figure out how to make it happen. It was as if we've written this process down and everybody's agreed to it, but there was no way for them to enforce it. And so what I came in and did for them is said, well, look, I'll just run your process then. I'll just take care of this. Anytime you get to the point in the process where you need to have the information security team review it, the next step for you then is send the document to me and I'll handle that piece of the process. And they're like, oh, okay, that sounds great. We can do that. So then it became my job to make sure that I knew whether or not they had sent documents to me to put into the process that I was building to have the information security team review these things. And you'd think that this would be a very simple thing, but I've seen this happen multiple times where following a process is very difficult. So you always have to have either be the person as the business owner who is going to enforce a process and write it out and make sure that everybody's doing it, or have somebody else who's going to be doing that, or it will never happen. Processes are subject to the laws of nature. They're subject to entropy, and they always fall apart unless there's somebody consistently saying, nope, this is the process. Here's the document again that shows our process. This is the step you're on here. This is the next step you need to take. And sometimes that's exactly what you have to do. Like, let's say that you have if we go back and look at, there's a policy for you to be able to enforce a disciplinary policy, right? So one of the things that has to happen, first of all, with a disciplinary policy is that you have to make sure that anybody you have in a management position understands what that policy is. They have to know it ahead of time, because one of the things that's going to happen is in a disciplinary scenario, if the policy isn't written down and first taught to the folks in your organization and explained to them, and everybody's not all on board with the way that the policy is drafted and what it means, you're going to run into a situation where I've seen that have resulted in lawsuits where folks do their own thing and they say, okay, we're going to engage in our own disciplinary action based on what we think needs to happen. And I actually saw that happen at a university where they decided to kick a student out based on some things that he had said that that their department didn't approve of. And so they went through this. They had this entire huge policy that was available, that was accessible on their website, that said, these are the ways, this is what you should expect, the process you should expect to go through when we're enforcing our disciplinary policy based on X, Y, and Z factors, whatever things that you've done that are wrong that we don't like. And the university didn't even follow its own process. And because of that, this student who got kicked out, he ended up settling with the university over time. But the university recognized that they were in big trouble because they hadn't even followed their own written process in order to enforce their disciplinary policy. And so you have to have this dynamic relationship between policies that say this is what's expected and processes that allow you to be able to say, okay, now this is how we enact this policy and this is how we engage it. And if you don't have that connection, then there'll be no way for you to actually enforce those things and make them stick. So it's just one of those things where you have to have somebody who's willing to constantly say, no, this is the way we do it. And if you have a written document, to make sure that that document gets forwarded to people every time that you see that there's a process violation, and you continue to have them say, put that document in front of them time after time after time and say, okay, now remember, we're on step number 3 here of the process. You need to move to step number 4, which is this. And if they can't follow that, you may need to find somebody else to help you out with what you're trying to accomplish, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to make sure that your policies are adopted and are effective. So how do you then write a policy that you can build into a process that's going to help you move things forward and make sure that things are consistently done within your organization? Writing policies are kind of boring when it comes right down to it, honestly. I've seen a lot of different policies and how they're drafted, and I've seen policy scenarios where there are big holes from one policy to the next. which is okay if that's the way that you want your business to operate. And there's only certain things that you are really concerned about. But when it comes down to some of those core policies that we talked about, like, a device use policy, what would be a good way to draft one of those? So one of the things that you need to keep track of with policy drafting is, one, who was involved in the drafting, who signed off on the draft, the core content of that draft, and just saying this is what our policy actually is, and it may have different pieces and aspects to it that you need to focus on. And you need to keep track of, well, what if we need to change this policy? There needs to be some sort of change management way built into the document that says, okay, this is actually version 3 of our device use policy. We had two prior versions that we've now updated from, and this is version 3 that we adopted on 6/9/2020, so that you can move forward and make revisions to your policies as needed. And so those are the kind of the core aspects of a policy document itself, is to have those things in it. Who's drafting the policy, who's signed off on the policy, you as a business owner, what the policy content is, and then change management, so you can keep track of changes you've made to it. It seems like that's very simple, but if you have, let's just think about, if you have 10 different policies in your organization as a small business that you want to make sure that those things are always kept up to speed and that you can fine tune those. Let's say that you go through and make changes to all 10 of those policies. You've kept very close track of what version you're on for each one of those and what the changes have been over time. Well, anytime you change that policy, the problem that you're going to end up having is you had employees or folks who are working for you who understood that policy as it was originally enacted, but then if you make that change, you've also got to have a change policy or a change management function that allows you to then update your employees or contractors or whoever's working for you to help them understand what the new policy is. And that can be a huge pain as well. One of the things that I always say is that communication is the hardest thing for us to do every day. And really, when you look at most of what business does, it revolves around communication and effective communication. And organizations that can communicate most effectively are the most effective at getting their work done, and they're successful. In my mind, at least those are the things that I think is the core to being successful, is that ability to communicate and make sure that other people know what you need them to do clearly, and then once they've gone out and done it, they can turn around and you can follow up with them and make sure that they've done it the right way. That flows down to enacting effective policies as well. If you don't have a way of making sure that everybody knows what the updated policy is, then you shouldn't even have a policy in the first place. And so some of the ways that I've seen that happen again are with those learning management systems where you're saying we've had a policy update, we need you to go back in and watch a new video based on this policy. Or it could just be in one of those things where you sit down in a company meeting with the 3 people who are in your business and say, okay, we've made an update to this policy. We just need to review this really quickly so everybody understands the change. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is highlight what the previous policy was, and make sure that everybody agreed that, yes, that's what we were doing before. And then make sure that everybody understands what the change is. And if you don't state what the change is from the status quo of what you were doing before, what you run into possibly doing to yourself is making it so that there was a disconnect from what the policy was before, and there may have been a misunderstanding of what it was previously, so the change may be misinterpreted and misapplied. So you want to make sure that you say, this is what the policy was, and make sure that everybody goes, oh, yeah, we were never doing it quite that way, were we? And say, yeah, you're right. We were never doing it quite that way, but this is what the old policy was and the way we were supposed to do it. This is the change that we're making to the policy and how we're going to accomplish it moving forward. And that mere fact of communicating what the policy was and what the new policy is will help make sure that to a greater extent that people follow the new policy, because it helps show that we're definitely moving forward. And as long as you can connect that to some sort of improvement that you're trying to accomplish and everybody can say, yes, that makes sense, then it makes updating the policy pretty straightforward. But like I said, policies are fairly boring things, except when people violate the policy. And that's when you run into some of the biggest issues, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, everybody writing policies and putting them in place and then drafting processes around those policies to make sure that they're built into the way you do your business. is a real pain. It takes a lot of time. It involves a lot of effort. But if you don't have it in place, then you do face additional issues with not being consistent in your business and potential liability. But if you do have them in place, you'll definitely know when somebody violates a policy, because it's usually a big deal. And it's one of those things where you're glad when you have those policy violation scenarios come up that you have the policy in the first place, because then you have a place to go back to and say, okay, we know what should have been done here. And it resolves so many arguments and issues that can develop if you didn't have the policy in place in the first place. So I think, most of us, we understand inherently, why we need to have policies or what they kind of are, because we've all been in environments where policies have been put in place. But I wanted to get back to the whole scenario of, let's say that you're able to put effective policies in place that deal with a bunch of things that are important to your business. You're able to build processes around those policies and say, okay, this is how we do things, and this is where this policy intersects our process of how we do things. Once you're able to do that and do it effectively, that there's a couple of things that accomplishes for you. One, it allows you to grow. It allows you to hire people and put them in front of your policy and say, this is how we do it. And it allows you to be consistent with those new employees. It allows you to continue to say, we're going to add 3 people to our sales team, and you put them in front of your policies and your process documents, and you walk through those with them in order to train them, and you're going to get consistent performance from those people on your sales team. If you can do that, and you can effectively make sure that your team is following your policy and your process, that's how you become an effective business. That's how you get things done. And that's how you service and take care of your customers, and that's how you grow. And at someday, let's say that you're being somewhat, let's say you're somewhat good at what you're doing within your business. You're able to make sure that you're consistent and that people know what they're doing within your organization. They're providing the service well that you want to provide, and somebody wants to come and buy your business from you. One of the things that they're definitely going to want to see is they're going to want to see that when you leave, being the person who started this business and you're the subject matter expert on everything that your business does, they're going to want to see that when you leave, that business isn't just going to collapse because nobody else knows what's going on. They're going to want to see that you've established proper policies, proper processes, and that everybody is following those things effectively, so that when you're gone, that business keeps functioning. And when they can see that you've taken the time to build out your business in a manner that is structured around policy and process, your business is going to be more valuable, and you're going to have more opportunities to sell your business if that's something that you want to do down the road. And if you don't want to sell your business, it's still going to be more valuable to you, because you're going to be able to grow your business in a fashion that will continue to allow you to provide consistent results for your customers and clients. So that's kind of really the end goal of policies development and process development. And that's the whole reason for doing it in the first place. So I've been blabbing here for a long time now. And so, and I wish I would have been able to figure out how to make my PowerPoint work, because it would have been a little bit more interesting, I think, in regards to just being able to have something to see instead of just looking at my ugly mug. But when it comes down to you all and your businesses, what questions do you have about putting policies and processes into place, or what issues have you run into where you felt like trying to accomplish that goal of doing the heavy lifting of putting policies in place has not worked for you, and you've gotten stuck? Anybody have any questions or any comments in regard to those type of scenarios in their own work?
One question I have is on balancing. It seems that in a small business, as it grows, that a small business, I don't think, would take on as many policies as a large organization. How to, I guess, pick the right balance of number of policies, because we can run around, I think, at least I feel I could run around trying to enforce policies with one person, or kind of let those evolve over time. And I've always been curious how to strike that balance.
Well, I think this is my perspective has always been, that there's definitely the potential for death by policy. I mean, there's always that. it's interesting. My wife and I homeschool, and right now the Commonwealth that we participate in has gotten to the point where they have drafted policies and rules for everything, which makes it, a very tedious and kind of difficult environment to function in. If one, you want to change something, and also two, if you just if you're like, well, this is just too heavy, it's burdensome, it's inefficient for us, right? So I think there's definitely that from a small business perspective, the place where developing a process and policy can overburden the organization. But when you're talking about a balance, you can't grow without effectively being able to communicate policies and processes as well. And so I would say, in some ways, if you go back to those 6 core things that we talked about as far as policy examples, workplace safety, disciplinary policy, device use, work hours, and then maybe just have like the external facing policies like late payment policies and return refund policies as kind of the basis. Those are a good place to start. And then if you as you start to be able to add more people, obviously you have to govern things, and the only way to govern things effectively are really by having common policies that everybody are aligned around in order to be able to make sure that you're getting the work done the way that you need to. So that there is, the question is going to be one that's kind of custom to each environment when it comes down to it. Everybody has to make their own call on it. But if you have, 2 or 3 employees and they're all doing different work, having a policy for each one of those environments may not be effective or efficient unless you do plan on growing. And if you plan on growing, your next step is really going to involve, I think, adding additional policy and process, because without that, you're going to have new people coming in, and it's going to be harder to make sure that everybody's working and functioning around a common set of requirements, really, when it comes down to it, I think. But maybe that was a long answer to a short question.
I appreciate that. And also, just so you know, on questions, people might have more, but there are some questions in the chat too, if you look at that. There are some points there as well.
There. Okay, so one question that Richard Holloman asked was, is there a menu of templates for suggested policies or customer adaptation? I definitely wanted to make sure that we could use a template, a policy template. So I can put that out in the Believe Teams files if that would help and be useful for everyone. It's the templates that I've functioned off of, in the Fortune 500 environment are fairly complex. I don't think that they, you need to be as complex or as formal as some of the documents that I've used in the past. But I can definitely put a template out there for you to take a look at that is more complex, that you could kind of water down a little bit if you wanted to. And that might be a great way to help determine, at least see some structure and how you might want to structure your own policies. Another question that Richard asked was, let's see here. I was just talking about potential pain points. A business may want to outsource efforts to develop process and policy, and that's definitely true. And I think that's something that maybe within the Believe Information Solutions team, it might not be a bad idea to have some folks who are a little bit more, have had experience developing policies and making sure that we have the ability to go in and say, hey, we can help you build these things out, and maybe have some sort of structure built around how we would provide that type of a service to a potential client, and help them as quickly as we can make sure that those types of policies and processes are put in place for them to help them build their organization. It's a good idea. Okay, and then Richard, it looks like you had another comment here. You said there's the gut sense challenge of policies alignment with company culture, trust, simplicity, mission focus, etc. Really the policy is going to be, obviously, the policies that you stand up within your organization are going to help drive the culture in a lot of ways. Because if you have policies that are super authoritarian and very tedious for folks, that's going to come across in your culture. But if you have policies that are designed to help, just make sure that everybody's functioning as a team and feel like that's what they're there to do, is be working together as an organization. That's a lot of the way that you draft your policies is going to help shape that culture and help people understand what it is that you, as the owner, as the CEO, whoever, you're going to understand how you want them to interoperate with you and within your organization, and you get to make some rhetorical choices as you build those policies to help determine how people are going to feel about your organization and their interaction with you. So it definitely is a place to inculcate that culture that you want to have in your company, in your policies, to determine, to help people see this is how we function and how we want our work environment to go. So is there anything, I think some of what I've talked about, at least to my mind, is still somewhat fairly vague, right? When you're talking about policies, so often most policies that businesses are going to adopt are going to be based on the experience of the people who are working within the organization. I think one of the things that, since we can only really talk about policies at a fairly high level unless we're actually working with a specific use case, one of the things that I would encourage is, if you are the owner of an organization and you're working on developing policies, is to make sure that the folks that you have in your organization work with you to develop them. Obviously, if you have policies that people feel like they've helped be able to create, that's going to give them a greater sense of ownership in those policies and the processes, and they're going to be more willing to want to engage in those things and use them. Okay, so I think that's, from my perspective, the things that I think I could go into a little bit more are just some more details about how I go about fleshing out processes. If anybody thinks that might be helpful, but it's not rocket science. It's mostly just about determining what the different steps that need to be accomplished are, and then just writing some language about that says this is what we need to do, and this is when we do it, and this is how we do it. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about process development in particular? Okay, so I think I've said my piece here. I think what I'll do is I can put some examples out in the Teams files of different process documents, and how there's a few different ways that you can engage in process development. One of my favorite ways is to develop swim lanes documents that show how, as you're moving through a process, how different parties have different responsibilities within that process. And so with the swim lane document, you can show here that, okay, we've got a document that comes in from our sales team, a request from a customer for something that they want for us to provide for them. Where does it go from there? Does it go from the sales team to your legal team? Does it go from the sales team to your CFO or to your financial team? Where does that document request go to in order to help make sure that that customer is being taken care of? And so with the swim lanes documents, you can show, okay, so this is what we need to have happen as the customer interacts with our company. Just a simple short example would be, we received a request from the customer. We say, okay, hey customer, we know that you want to buy this service from us. Let's send you over a contract that outlines that. Have the customer review the contract, and so that's going to go from customer to your sales team, back up to the customer, and I'm trying to show it on the screen here so my hand's kind of making progress. Customer, sales team, customer, and then the customer might say, I need to make some modifications to this contract. And so then those modifications come back to your sales team, and they go, yeah, we're going to have legal look at that. You send it to your general counsel or whoever you have who's working on the legal part of that for you, if that's part of how your business functions. And so then once you get that contract hammered out, then you can move that on to somebody who can help provide the services to the customer. Maybe that's somebody on your ops team, or
that might be you as the business owner, the person who knows how to get the work done. And then at that point, you'll say, the business owner gets, or whoever is in charge of providing the service gets that done as part of the swim lane. Then what happens after the service is done? Is there some sort of sign off that you need from the customer? Is there, something at that point that says, hey, we've got this project done and we're ready to get paid? Is that just a matter of you at that point generating an invoice and submitting it back to the customer? Who generates the invoice, and what information needs to be on that? And once that payment comes back for that invoice, who goes to make sure that the payment is reconciled against the invoice in your system, your financial system? And then beyond that, is there additional follow-up that you want to make with that customer that shows them that, hey, we appreciate your business, we'd like more of it? So this, just developing a swim lane document that shows a simple process like that is super helpful in at least defining, for people who are working in the organization, this is the way that it should happen. And that way, if one of your key employees gets hit by a bus or something, you can bring somebody in fairly quickly and get them up to speed as to what we need them to do to help them accomplish, their part of the process in helping bring more business in and get services provided to our customers. Another thing that I like to do is, outside of a swim lane document, is also just generate a workflow document that spells out what your workflow is. And can provide additional details within that to a level that you can't really do in a swim lane document. Swim lanes are great for the visual aspect of it and seeing who's doing what when. The process document will take the elements of your swim lane and break those down and provide additional details around them so that you can further flesh out your process and make sure that if there are areas where you need to get really detailed, you can do that right there in your process document. And sometimes it helps you, as you're developing those process documents, it helps you think through your process. It helps you find inefficiencies as well. It gives you the opportunity to say, maybe we can improve what we're doing here and make this easier on our customers or make it easier on ourselves in the way that we interact with the market that we're interacting with. Those are kind of the two key things that I've seen that are effective. And then obviously, if you're dealing with outward-facing policies that you're interacting with your customers through, or that you need your customers to understand and abide by, one of the best places to put those policies or the process is just right into your contract with the customer. Just make sure that that's part of your relationship with them. And obviously, at that point, everybody's bound by the rules of engagement in the contract if that's a way to do it. If you're just doing sale of goods in some sort of a over-the-counter retail environment, having policies posted. We've all seen that when you walk into a store in the mall. They'll have their return, refund policies posted there. They'll have them generated on their receipts. Late payment policy, all those types of things are just right there, so that it's pretty clear, what the rules of engagement are with that business, and that there's no confusion about those things. So in the end, I think really policy is just about setting expectations internally within your organization and setting expectations with folks outside of your organization so you can be consistent about the work that you do and be efficient and effective. And it's a means, it's a tool of communicating to folks over time the things that the business needs to have accomplished. And so if you look at it that way as being a means of communicating with folks over time, I think that's really the best way to look at policies, because that's, like, again, what I said, communication is the hardest thing that we have to do each day. So if we can make sure that our communication is persistent and consistent, the end result is probably going to be better than if we can't rise to that level. So that's all I have to say about policies and processes right now.
Thanks, Corey. And if anyone on the call doesn't have access to Teams and wants a copy of those documents, just shoot me an email. I'm Austin. You should have received an email from me for the class registration, and we can get those over to you. But thanks for your time today, Corey. We sure appreciate it.
Sure. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that's I like to do. It's in some ways kind of dry, but I guess I like that for some reason. Okay, thank you all.
Okay, we'll talk later.
Thank you.